Thank you for joining us in the Engaged by Design podcast today. If you're a college leader, a nonprofit director, or a business strategist, this episode is especially for you.
In this episode, you'll walk away with a framework and real tools that you can implement today to enhance your prioritization skills.
Welcome to the Engaged by Design podcast, where we explore the principles that help institutions and organizations thrive in today's dynamic environment. I'm Dr. Michael Cottam, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleague and co-founder of Engaged by Design, Dr. Vernon Smith. In our last episode, we shared the mission of Engaged by Design and discussed the macro leadership framework and how that helps us to deal with today's VUCA environment. Today, we're diving into one of the most critical yet overlooked aspects of organizational success: strategic planning and prioritization. Effective prioritization helps us to focus our efforts on the most impactful initiatives at all levels of the organization.
I'm glad to be with you, Michael. As you know, prioritization is a topic that I'm deeply passionate about because I've seen firsthand how it can make or break an institution's ability to deliver on its mission. When new, shiny objects appear, and they always do, what keeps your team or organization from dropping what it was doing to chase it? Or, when it is a good idea, how do you reassess the value of the shiny object and then look at its future opportunities?
So let me start with a question for you, Vernon. Have you ever been part of an organization that chases every shining object?
Absolutely. Haven't we all? All of us want to do more, but the fact is, it can't be done. And if you try to, the results are rarely good. You'll end up with unintended consequences such as burnout in your teams, missed deadlines, people working cross purposes and competing for resources. Prioritization isn't just a managerial or leadership task. It's a strategic imperative for every level of the organization, but especially for those leading in the middle.
That's absolutely right. And there's a persistent myth in our culture that we can get everything done just because we said so. I question if we even should try to get everything done. Those who preach a hyper-productivity mindset put pressure on us to do more with less every year, always doing more without more resources. So do you remember the rocks in the jar analogy? It was made popular by Stephen Covey. He was the author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Do you remember that one?
I do. In fact, Stephen Covey was one of the founders of my Master of Organizational Behavior program.
Ah, that's right. Well, you can still find videos of Covey teaching this lesson on stage, and we'll put that in the show notes for you. He places at the beginning of the video or his presentations with a large auditorium and a large audience. He puts a large transparent jar on a table in front of the crowd where everybody can see it. Then he puts containers of rocks and stones and pebbles and sand, all of different sizes, large to small. Now, the jar represents your time and your attention. The rocks and the stones represent the tasks you want to complete. Those are your priorities. So then he asks an audience member to fit everything into the jar. Of course, you can imagine this, the first time they try, they start with the sand and then the pebbles, and then they try to fit the big rocks on top. But it never works. I know you can see that in your mind when I talk about it. The big rocks don't fit in when you begin with the sand. And if the big rocks are your big important tasks, you never get them done because you're doing all the trivial things. So then Covey shows how it can be done. When you start with the big rocks, put those in the jar first at the bottom, then you add in the stones and eventually the sand, it magically all fits into the jar. Now, the lesson he's teaching here is one of his habits, which is putting first things first. So if you put your most important and impactful responsibilities first, they can get done because that's what matters to you most. And then you can fit in all the rest of the smaller or less important tasks into the jar. And, I love this lesson. I've heard it referenced for, I don't know, getting close to 30 years. It's great, but it is flawed.
It's flawed.
Absolutely flawed. There are more rocks, more stones, and more sand in our lives than ever before.
True.
As a leader, wherever you are in the organization, you have to say no to a lot of the small things. You have to say no to the smaller rocks that don't matter as much, and you definitely have to say no to the sand. If we want to pay any attention to the most important big rocks, we have to focus there.
Yeah, Michael, that makes me think of the old I Love Lucy sketch of Lucy and Ethel at the chocolate factory. You might remember that. For those who haven't seen it, we should put a link in the show notes. But it's a great metaphor for our time, our era. After doing lots of job switching, Ethel and Lucy, job switching, I mean that they didn't do a good job, and so they made them do something else. Ethel and Lucy are working at a conveyor belt where they wrap up chocolates. They're given instructions by their manager, and chocolates start to come. And they come out in a manageable rate on this conveyor belt. And they think, this is going to be easy. But then the belt speeds up. They can't keep up with the number of chocolates to wrap. Soon they're pulling them from the conveyor to hide the fact that they can't keep up. They begin stuffing chocolates into their mouths so they don't get fired for leaving a single chocolate unwrapped. The metaphor is this: we are Lucy and Ethel. The chocolates are the tasks coming our way faster and faster all the time. We assume that we have enough time, resources, and everything to get it all done. And we also assume that the conditions will not change. Our managers have that expectation as well. The reality is that we're moving faster than ever with shorter delivery cycles in a dynamic, uncertain environment. We can't keep up. We have to decide what our priorities are and what we will do and what we will not do. Although, Michael, I do like the idea of eating chocolate at work, but eating all the chocolate is not possible and not very healthy.
Oh, I completely agree about we need more chocolate at work. That's my idea, right? But what we fall into, like you're saying, the Lucy and Ethel sketch that's so popular, I can't believe, I guess maybe younger generations may not have seen it. But we all fall into this trap of overestimating what we can and should do. Maybe especially as managers. We think, we can just speed up the conveyor belt and our people will be able to keep up. There's a couple of laws of time management that I think of related to this. First is maybe Parkinson's law, which states that the work will expand to fill the time that's allotted for it.
Yeah, and I'd add Hofstadter's law, which is the idea that it always takes longer than you expect to complete a task, even when you're aware of this tendency and plan for the extra time needed.
These two laws, both Parkinson's law and Hofstadter's law, are in constant tension. The one says work will fill the time allotted, which kind of implies you should shorten your timeline so that the work will take shorter time. But the other one states that the work will always take longer than you think it will. There's a dynamic tension that happens because they're both in play all the time. It's just human nature. You're aware of them, you can name them, but you can't really avoid them. And as leaders, it's really important for us to recognize this about ourselves and about our teams. They can't always do what we're asking them to do.
Especially, this is important, Michael, for planning.
Yeah. And, I've been the frontline worker who is given all of these tasks and the conveyor belt still, keeps going faster and faster and I can't keep up and you feel horrible like you're letting everybody down. I've been that person. I've also been the manager and the leader who sped up the conveyor belt and really tortured my people. I've done both. These two laws kind of present a trap that we're stuck in. It's absolutely a trap. So to escape the trap, we need a good system, a prioritization system, a planning system, as well as the habits to revise, to revisit our priorities, and make sure that we do things better all the time rather than falling into the trap over and over again. So in today's episode, here's what we're going to cover. Number one, strategic planning and prioritization in higher education. We're going to talk about how prioritization and our process often fails us. The third one is we're going to talk about best practices and a few ideas for how prioritization can work better. We're going to give process and ideas to help you out. And the fourth thing is practical steps to improve your prioritization skills. So, 4 things to cover. Vernon, let's break that down. How do you prioritize work in higher ed?
Okay, let me grab my notes here. I'm going to get this right. Prioritization is the process of deciding the order in which actions, projects, or tasks should be tackled based on the strategic goals, resources, and expected outcomes. So for today, the principle is this. Effective prioritization drives strategic success, especially when trying to move the organization through change or transformation. When colleges try to do everything, they often achieve nothing. Leaders must, they've got to build clarity, consistency, and I believe transparency into their prioritization processes. Michael, the most atomic level of prioritization can be found in budgeting decisions. Where you actually spend and invest your funds and resources is the best way to examine your true priorities. Follow the money, like they say. Prioritization is usually embedded in a strategic plan. In higher ed, we love our strategic plans, especially when they're completed. Now, if you're like me, you love the strategic planning process. In fact, strategic is my top Clifton strength.
Oh, and I've seen you use it over and over at multiple institutions. You love strategy.
I love strategy. But just because I love strategic planning or we love our strategic plans doesn't mean that they're effective.
Right.
Typically, strategic planning happens on a cycle. Everyone knows this, right? Strategic plans can be 1 to 3 to 5 to 100 years. In fact, some organizations like Rotary International, a shout out to my fellow Rotarians, they're very proud of the fact that they have a 100-year strategic plan. But the fact is that for most of us, especially in these turbulent times and turbulent environment, a realistic plan can only be trusted for maybe 18 months to 3 years before the market and technology changes, student expectations and behavior shift. It's very, very VUCA. Or you might have a pandemic that shuts down the world. How effective do you think all those strategic plans that were made in 2020 ended up over time now that we're in 2025?
I think they may have ended up on a shelf or in the trash bin or something. The pandemic just shows one of the big things that happen in the VUCA environment. But like the volatility, the uncertainty, it's around us all the time, even if some great big worldwide event doesn't happen. So you're bringing up a great point. We have standard planning cycles, those 1, 3, 5 year, or 100-year for Rotary. We try to follow them every year. We try to be systematic and rational about it. We have smart people as presidents, provosts, and deans in our colleges and universities. But we also know that no plan we make survives contact with the enemy. Now, that's a military metaphor, but in our case, we may not be going to battle, but the frequent shifts in the higher education environment, in policy and regulation, and things that happen in the marketplace that are even outside of our control and they're really unpredictable. No plan survives that contact. So,
Yep.
what I want to know is, how do things go so wrong in spite of all of the smart, dedicated people putting so much attention on the strategy? What kinds of things go wrong?
Well, back to the common practice in higher ed. Once the plan is printed, oftentimes on this beautiful glossy paper, and circulated around and put into nice PowerPoint presentations and shown to the board of trustees or the different community members and stakeholders, it gets put on a shelf. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, it sounds familiar to me. I've been there.
And then the beautiful printed document stays on that shelf where it gathers dust. If you're lucky, you may need to grab it off the shelf before your planning period ends, like for an accreditation visit, for example, where you have to show how you're living and following your strategy. But let's be real, strategic planning is often done after the budgeting process has been completed. And we've all experienced this. The problem is that budgets are annual, or sometimes they're updated quarterly in some sectors, while on the other hand, we're talking about strategic plans being of 3, 5, or 100 years.
Right. I've seen the budgets and the plans change most during financial crisis. It seems like strategy wins when you're comfortable, but the short-term budget concerns win anytime times are hard. Anytime there's a change, you go to short-term budget thinking, and the strategic plan seems to go out the window.
I love that. Here's another tension. So we have a long-term strategy and a short-term budget. When push comes to shove, often it's the short-term budget that will affect and alter the long-term strategy without significant process. It's a type of organizational nearsightedness. Budgets are nearsighted, strategy is farsighted. So, Michael, as you've seen and I've seen, the strategic plan will undergo changes after the budget process has been approved. We might call it let's call it, I meant to do that strategy planning process.
So, I've seen it, but what do you mean by the "I meant to do that" planning? It sounds a little backwards.
Yeah, well, it's like putting the cart in front of the horse, exactly. In terms of organizational theory, this is retrospective sense making. Carl White
Mm,
taught us those principles. We try to make sense of things by looking at them backwards and creating meaning. You try to create a shared memory. Hindsight's 2020, right?
right. So practically, I think what you're saying is that leaders fail to make a good plan or a resilient plan or a flexible plan. Then they fail to follow that plan. And then afterwards, when they have to do a nice, shiny report, they report what happened as if it were intentional. Is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. That you nailed it. Another way of seeing it, instead of retrospective sense making, might be through the lens of organizational cognitive dissonance resolution,
Hmm.
right? Organizations do this like people. They intend to do one thing, but got distracted or detoured and take a different path. And then when the narrative is created afterward, post hoc, they try to bridge the gap between what they professed they wanted to do and what they actually did, or to justify or rationalize why they did it.
It's like cognitive dissonance is just really uncomfortable. And it happens in all parts of our lives, even in that purposeful work culture that we're in, where we're pretty disciplined. So, what keeps us from taking that path of deviating and then justifying it? So, how do we avoid the kinds of mistakes you're talking about?
I believe the answer is really holding fast to our values. They become unalterable. We hold to the values. Strategic planning really can't happen effectively until you know and abide by your organizational values. Because when push comes to shove, the organizational culture will override the strategy.
Oh, yeah, the old saying of culture eats strategy for breakfast. It does every day. Culture has this momentum, it has this power. in an organization. And if a strategy doesn't make sense within the culture or it no longer seems relevant, the culture wins. So, what are some specific ways that your planning and your prioritization, what are some specific ways that they fail so often in our organizational cultures?
Michael, let's focus on 5 key reasons for poor prioritization. The first one we'll call lack of transparency and meaning. The second is a lack of sufficient stakeholder involvement. Third
Mhm.
is moving to a reactivity mindset instead of proactivity. Fourth, I'd say making decisions political, driving internal competition for information, resources, and support. In other words, small areas of the organization are seeking for power. And of course, inflexibility in the face of external turbulence.
Right. And those all seem like tendencies that we all fall into as leaders, whether we're at the top or in the middle, you know, keeping things to ourselves or thinking that things will work better if we try to control how the word gets out and everything. So they each sound like solvable problems, though. If you have a really good, robust process, you could solve it. So, can you give some specific examples of how the priorities get mixed up in some of these 5 ways you talked about?
Sure. So let's start with transparency and stakeholder involvement, which is critical. Sometimes top leaders at the college or university will go on a retreat and create a
Mm.
plan in isolation and then come back and top down present it to the rest of the college. And this kind of process inevitably lacks key perspectives of people who are not in the room. And it results in confusion and misalignment. North America, particularly US businesses, governments, higher education, and other complex organizations, are known for shorter planning times, but very long implementation times.
Hmm.
This contrasts with other regions like Asia and Japan, where the planning cycles are much longer, much longer, to provide greater transparency and stakeholder involvement, yet they require much shorter implementation times. Because when it's go time, everyone is on board, they understand the plan, they understand their parts, they understand their roles, and they're ready to move.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see how having more patience, maybe more deliberation, and more engagement, more involvement in that planning cycle from all parts of the organization, that can help improve buy-in, therefore implementation goes faster.
Exactly. Another trap we fall into is that assuming that things will stay the same for the next 3 years or 5 years,
Hmm.
rather than recognizing the instability in our environment. We don't get proactive enough in our forecasting and we end up reacting to changes instead of making change happen.
Hmm.
The next one is, of course, inflexibility. The market keeps changing. Look at higher ed today. Just read the headlines. You'll know that it's a time of fundamental structural crisis where fundamental assumptions can't be assumed, especially around funding and student enrollment. So if you're at a college or university or nonprofit or other complex organization, last year's plan is not relevant to today's reality. We need to review and revise our strategic plans more frequently than usual. Our strategic plans need to be living documents.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. If they're living documents, it makes our strategic plan more flexible in the short term, which, frankly, that's a change from how things used to be when we could plan for 3 or 5 years
Yep.
with some level of comfort. But today we need to be more agile. We need to be able to pivot.
Agile is a key concept here, Michael. Strong organizations, especially in higher ed, understand the process of prioritization requires input from all stakeholders whenever the change happens. So in higher education, we actually have a built in mechanism for that, and we call it shared governance.
Hmm.
and it's built into the process of planning and prioritization and when it's done right. But it can also slow down the process, which is a good thing and a bad thing. When we are competing with values or competing with priorities between the different groups, it becomes critical to have a common mental model of how you're going to address those differences.
Right. So having a common model, common mental model, a way of thinking about it, process, your habits that we were talking about earlier. If you have that in place, you can be more agile. So this is probably an easy question, but can you think of a case study of how prioritization goes wrong?
Well, let me, if you want a formal case study, there's one that's worth reading. That was a great article in the Harvard Business Review in December 2024 entitled Three Reasons Change Initiatives Fail and How to Ensure Yours Succeeds by Dushel Langdon and Rodriguez Gomez Rico. So if you want to read something in depth, that's a good place to go. In my own experience, the root of the problem comes from competing interests, the politics, initiative fatigue, too many shiny objects, overwhelm, uh, think of the rocks and sand in the jar, and not establishing trusting relationships with all the critical stakeholders.
Hmm.
When we have these conditions present, they can create ambiguity and organizational misalignment, and it results in ineffective outcomes at a minimum, and more likely paralysis and failure on the other side of the spectrum. Prioritization and shared governance is really about relationships and the perceived value of which actions count or don't count, right? Going back to the
Hmm.
culture and the values. When stresses during implementation come, and everyone will get stressed out during implementation phase, it's the strength and trust inherent in those relationships that create resilience and continuity that result in success.
Yeah, it's always relationships. The culture is built on relationships between people, and it's the key to success in stressful times. It's pretty easy to get along when things are easy or smooth. The test of the relationship is what do you do or how do you act when things are hard, when you have to make cuts or you have to change your plans. So I totally agree. In terms of setting and revising our priorities, we have to be agile. We have to be inclusive at the same time with that shared governance idea in higher ed. We have to keep engaging, even when it's hard, with all the parts of the university, even when we enact change in turbulent times. And I might say that I've seen some of the best ideas come from the front lines. So keeping everybody involved and keeping those relationships strong helps us to pivot.
Yeah, keep everyone in the room. Don't dismiss them from the room. And, it's like leave no one behind in a time of crisis.
Absolutely. People can get hurt. You can't leave them behind. So, Vernon, today we've talked about some of the challenges, right? What can we do to get better? So, what are some of the best practices that you've seen across other institutions, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, I'm all about improvement. You know that. Relentless improvement. Well, first thing we could do is establish clear and transparent criteria, right? The alignment, the impact, the feasibility, the urgency, and have those common assumptions, understand what they mean. Next, I think we need to use, and this is a tool that everyone should be using, the Eisenhower Matrix. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a sec, but that's urgency and importance. You can use the Moscow method, that an acronym for must have, should have, could have, won't have, or maybe the RICE scoring, which is reach, impact, confidence, and effort. Michael, we should add a link to an Eisenhower Matrix as an example in our show notes.
Oh, yeah, we can do that. Each of the ones that you've mentioned are tools that are meant to help us collaborate and listen to one another. in terms of what we think is urgent, important, what we should have done, what we could have done, what we won't have. Understanding the reach, the impact, the confidence and effort in a given set of priorities.
Yeah.
So imagine a very simple one. We mentioned the Eisenhower Matrix because it is so simple and useful. So imagine a 2x2 matrix. So it's like a square with lines down the middle vertically and horizontally. And you have on the one axis, you have urgency, something that is really urgent versus not urgent. And you can probably think of tasks or projects that fall into that. But you have to contrast that or put it against the importance axis of the 2x2 matrix. So the 4 quadrants, and think about this in the 4 quadrants of the 2x2 matrix, would be labeled low urgency, low importance. And you can imagine what we might do with those tasks. Low urgency, low importance. The second one might be low urgency, but high importance. Imagine it might not be urgent, but you really need to do it, so you might be able to take time on it. Another of the squares is high urgency and low importance. Super urgent, it must be done, but it may not have a huge impact, not as important. Now, the last one is maybe the easiest one to figure out, or we think it is, and that's high urgency and high importance. So to use this kind of a matrix, you put that on the wall or on the screen in the room, and you brainstorm all of the projects or all of the tasks that you have to do. And you can do this from the top of the organization, from the middle, or even to the individual contributor in your teams. So you take those projects and you place them into the quadrants through discussion rather than just one person's view. So the projects that end up in that high urgency, high importance square, those are obviously the ones you want to focus on. The temptation is to put everything in that quadrant. That's how we end up with a jar full of sand. But anything that falls in the low urgency, low importance quadrant, the one I mentioned first, should probably be dropped from your list. And the challenge when you do this activity is rarely do we put anything in that square. But it becomes apparent that you have to have things in that square. There are things that are low urgency and low importance, and those need to be put off or delayed or gone. The hard conversations are really about those other 2 quadrants, the low urgency, high importance, and the high urgency, low importance. That's where the discussion really comes in. The power is when you have the perspectives from the front line, the middle, and the top, you can make better decisions on which ones end up in which quadrant and which ones end up as priority 1 and which ones are priority 30, right? So it helps to use this visual activity to create the common mental model we've been talking about of what really matters to you and what matters to the organization. Does that make sense?
It does, Michael. I mean, folks joining us on this podcast might want to think of the last 2 or 3 fires they put out. Activities at work, what are the fires they put out, and where they would put that in the matrix, and see what's governing what they do and what is driving things. And just like where you put your money to show your priorities, where you're putting your time is also another measure of what your real values and your real priorities are. Maybe you don't want them to be that, but this tool can help. And we've also mentioned engaging cross-functional stakeholders and reassessing regularly. It's not a one-time task. This planning process has to be agile.
Right. It is an iterative process that the quadrants that you make, you're tempted to have this process and then put that on the shelf and not look at it again. That's a mistake. So you have to use it iteratively and revise it regularly with your team. So, Vernon, can you give us an example of a successful prioritization from your experience?
Michael, sure. When I was leading innovation at multiple large online institutions primarily, we introduced a weighting scoring system for IT project evaluation. Everyone these days, because of technology, has something in IT that they need to have for their part of the organization. It included metrics like student success impact, the operational feasibility, the cost, the return on investment, and strategic alignment with the strategic plan. You know, and there were competing projects that had things like, a new ERP for student records, a new CRM for student recruitment, a new LMS that should support teaching and learning, which should be the core of any institution of higher education. Um, Financial aid systems, of course, in the environment, cybersecurity measures, right? Compliance with changing regulations that are all over the place. So we met as cross-functional leaders and we had to reorder and trim the project queue by developing a clear order of prioritization given our finite resources and time. We need to give space and resources to fewer initiatives as a result so that we could complete them. We couldn't do everything. Now, not saying it wasn't a political process with different parts of the organization vying to be the next one in the queue or different leaders advocating for the importance of their project over others, but it did move us closer to an understandable and successful prioritization process. It can never be a perfect process because whenever there's competing interests or competing priorities underneath in the subunits of the organization, you can approximate, but you can't really make it perfect. You can agree on
Yeah,
things at least.
right. And I think, like I was saying before, it's that discussion that helps to bring the common mental model together. So even if you don't get your pet project on, you know why, or you know that we have decided that something else is more important. So that's an example. I've seen very similar things, and IT projects are, well, because they're so resource intensive.
Yeah.
Uh, that's a great story that I think we can all relate to, no matter the size of your organization. You're always looking to improve out of necessity or out of a desire to make student learning the key metric of your organization.
We care about that, key learning. The hardest part of that process is actually coming up with the criteria.
Right,
That's where the real
right.
conversation is. What are our criteria? What are the things that we're going to value and use that to rank the order of the different projects
Yep.
and priorities? So I'm sure everyone's been through this, but it's those other key elements of getting people involved and then helping them once a decision is made, get behind that decision because everyone knows why.
Yeah. So great story to wrap it up for this episode. So I want to invite all the listeners, take a moment, reflect on the tools we've talked about, the challenges we've talked about today. Is your organization prioritizing with purpose? Is there a proactive approach? Or are you reacting to the loudest voice or the most outrageous change that's happening in higher ed today? Or are there things that we have discussed that might help you to improve your prioritization skills? So think about this from wherever you are in the organization. This is important. Top, middle, front line, wherever you are. What are the top 5 priorities in your organization or your part of the institution right now? So what are your top 5? Then think about, how were they selected? What are your norms or your values around engaging stakeholders? Thinking of your 5, how were you involved in it? What are the norms for you? Then think about how your priorities align. Are they truly aligned with your values, with the mission of the institution, or your capacity to get things done? Is there alignment? And maybe the last question is, how might you adapt your priorities to deal with the emerging changes in the environment, inside and outside of your institution?
Michael,
Those are hard questions.
they are hard questions, and Michael, but those are good questions for reflection.
So, Vernon, thank you for sharing your insights today. I know you have a lot of experience in this area and you love strategy.
I love strategy. Well, it's my pleasure, Michael. Prioritization is one of the most empowering skill sets that a leader can adopt and then model for their teams. And, leadership oftentimes is helping set the priorities and then building a path to achieve those things, have that vision.
Right. So thank you to our listeners. If you found value in today's discussion, please like, subscribe, and please share. Share what you're learning with a colleague, maybe with your leadership team. We really want to build organizations that are not just busy, but truly effective at getting the big, most important, most impactful things done for students.
Yeah, it's all about students. So until next time, please remember to prioritize intentionally with purpose, lead with clarity, and engage by design.
Engage by design. That's the name of the game.
Yep.